Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Reinhold. I'm the Dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. And I'm just purely here to introduce Professor Joshua Zimmerman, who is speaking to us tonight. Thank you to those of you who are here in person, to those of you joining us on Zoom. One point of order is, if you have any questions on Zoom, then do put them into the chat. And then at the end, I will put questions from the chat and from in here to Professor Zimmerman, okay? So without further ado, Professor Joshua Zimmerman is Professor of History here at Yeshiva University, where he holds the Eli and Diana Zabrowski Chair in Holocaust Studies and East European Jewish History. He's the author of 3 books, including The Polish Underground and the Jews 1939 to 1945, published in 2015, and Poles, Jews and the Politics of Nationality in Late Imperial Russia, 1892 to 1914, which was published in 2004. He's edited 2 contributed volumes, both based on conferences organized at YU, Jews in Italy under fascist and Nazi rule, 1922 to 1945, which took place 2005, and Contested Memories, Poles and Jews during the Holocaust and its Aftermath, which took place in 2003. Placing current events in historical context, Professor Zimmerman's newspaper articles, most recently on the war in Ukraine, have appeared in the Washington Post, Politico, Times of Israel, Daily Beast, Kiev Post, Engelsberg Ideas, and the Polish daily newspaper, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce.
Rzeczpospolita, the Republic.
Tonight, Professor Zimmerman will speak about his latest book, which has certainly caused quite a stir in the community of modern historians. Jozef Pisuldski, founding father of modern Poland, came out June 2022 with Harvard University Press. Professor Zimmerman.
Well, thank you so much to Professor Reinhold, who's Dean of the Bernard Revel Graduate School, for inviting me to give this book talk, and for everyone who's attending in person and virtually. I think I'd begin actually on a personal note, and the personal note would be what drew me to this figure as a Jewish American, 3rd generation, where my 8 great-grandparents arrived here before 1914, and I grew up in Southern California, perhaps geographically as distant as you could be from Eastern Europe, and then remote from those generations who arrived. Thank you. Thank you. And remote chronologically from those generations who arrived before 1914. So sometimes I'm asked this question: what drew me in? And part of it was that as an undergraduate student at the University of California at Santa Cruz, I was a history major, and I ended up focusing on the history of Russia, because we had a very esteemed Russian history professor named Peter Kinez. And in my junior year, I took a seminar on the Russian Revolution. And I don't remember how I got to be assigned this, but I was assigned the subject of the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. And I took up the project to do the research paper and give an oral report in the class. And that's when I first encountered this name of Jozef Pisuldski, because in 1920, he was head of state and commander-in-chief of a new country called Poland, within whose borders resided Europe's largest Jewish community. And I wanted to actually begin by going to, let me just see if I can, something's happening here. Oh, here we go. I wanted to show this. I'm going to actually have to go up because I don't know where I put this chart. Oh, I may not have done it. I'm sorry. Let me go back. We don't have to put the chart up. That's fine. But there was roughly 9.6 million Jews in Europe in the year 1931, of whom 3.2, or 1 in every 3, lived within the boundaries of this Polish state. And Pisuldzki was the leader of that country. And at the time that I took up that study, I was under the impression of a kind of perception of Poland as anti-Semitic, a country that despised Jews. And yet I encountered this figure who I'm told was pro-Jewish, opposed to anti-Semitism, and that the Jews of Poland regarded as their protector. And so for me, this was a tension between maybe what we call collective memory, in which this is the general perception, and I counter that often, and then the historical record. So my question in my mind at age 20 was, is this an anomaly, or did he represent some kind of a current in Polish liberal thought? In other words, a kind of a beacon of pluralism, tolerance, and a vision of their state that was multinational, multilingual, multi-religious, and one that practiced rule of law and respect for minority rights, so, which is what he represented at the time. And then I came across what was then one of the few books on Pisuldzki, because this was 1988, and at the time there was one book in English called Pisuldzki, the founder of, no, I'm sorry, it was Pisuldzki, something like founder of Poland or the builder of Poland. It had been written in 1981. It was a popular book with no footnotes and 2 pages, a 2-page bibliography. But it happened to be written by someone named Wacław Jędrzejewicz, who himself had served in Piłsudski's government in 1934 as Minister of Education, and then became director of the Piłsudski Institute in New York, and then edited a 3-volume book called Chronicle of the Life of Piłsudski. And that book was very favorable towards this head of state, and it emphasized this pluralism and kind of intolerance. So that's really what drew me. And then in addition, I came across a book at the time. It had just been published in 1987, and it was by a British historian named Neil Asherson, and it came out. It was called The Struggles for Poland, and in there he made this statement that really drew me in, and that statement was Piłsudski didn't pay much attention to who of his colleagues were Jewish or not Jewish. He felt that Jews were part of the heritage of Poland, and he judged them more by the content of their character rather than their place of birth or religious background. And I was kind of struck by that particular. I remember writing that down on a sheet of paper, filing it, and then returning to it in the next 2 decades. And why would I return to it in the next 2 decades? And that is because I started reading as much as I could on the subject. I learned the language, Polish, and started reading what was available. And about 10 years after that, in 1997, there was a scholar an American scholar who made a comment in a journal. He was reviewing a book about Piłsudski in Poland, and his comment was, there is no actual adequate scholarly biography in any language. Why? Because we have this troubled legacy of the communist period, in which from the communist imposition of power, seizure of power in 1948, till their dissolution in 1989, Poland was behind the Iron Curtain. And that meant that the government determined how history was interpreted. And that interpretation is that Piłsudski, who, as commander-in-chief, was the only military commander in the 20th century to soundly defeat the Russians, which happened in 1920, he was anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and therefore we're going to demonize him. So he was characterized for 50 years in Poland as a foe of democracy, as an opponent of freedom, and as a, quote, fascist. How they came up with fascist. But we do have this kind of pattern in which during the interwar period and after, communists characterize anyone who was opposed to communism as a fascist. So we have that. But it meant that for 50 years in communist Poland, the founder of modern Poland, the equivalent of the George Washington of Poland, was stricken from the historical record. So it'd be as if for 50 years between 1940 8 in 1989, the word George Washington was not allowed to be spoken in public in the United States or in the classroom. And it's kind of a scenario we can't imagine. So if you can imagine marking Independence Day, July 4th, and in the United States government says, well, you can mark it, but you're not allowed to utter the words George Washington. Well, that's what happened for a half century in this country, where they could mark it, but Pisuldzki was banned. Why? Because he was an anti-communist. And that's what was emphasized there. Now, after the fall of communism in 1989, there was an explosion of interest. And suddenly the person whose monuments were knocked down, statues, and his name was erased from the historical record, suddenly statues arose everywhere. And today he is the George Washington of Poland, meaning there's almost every town and every city has a major street named after Pisuldzki, and there's monuments to him and statues in also every city that are very prominent. And they were erected after the fall of communism. So you think of it's very symbolic. If you think of this as the Soviet tanks rolled into Poland in 1939 with their pact with Nazi Germany, one of the first things they did was knock down Pisuldzki statues. And then 50 years later, they have to be re-erected. So there's a lot of symbolism in these particular monuments and statues. Okay, so now what I want to do is go into kind of what is the meaning of Pisuldzki in terms of collective Jewish memory in Poland. So I'm gonna start with a more general discussion of who he was and where he came from. So we're going to start with origins. This was something very personal that I thought I'd present, which is, it's almost amazing, but exactly 30 years ago in 1992, do you remember I said I was an undergraduate taking this class? Well, I needed something on Pisuldzki. So my mom, who was a bookseller, got me this copy I was mentioning called Pisuldzki, A Life for Poland from 1981. And there she dedicates it, to me, saying something like, whose excitement for this subject spreads to us all. Okay, how is an American Jew excited at age 20 about Pisuldzki? So this is, I'll try to maybe explain some of this. So we're going to start with ancestry and childhood. So I'm thinking of when you're constructing the portrait of a figure like the head of state, someone so central, just because today he's so central to the point where not only do we have whole parks in the center of the capital named after him and monuments, but now you have football stadiums, hospitals, and train stations as well, and libraries and schools. So something about him is he is a person to aspire to in Poland. Something about his character, but the central thing is that he becomes head of state when Poland is reborn in 1918. He presides over the armed forces. He carves out borders, and he defeats the Russians. And in his conflict with the Russians, we'll see, he tries to create an independent Ukraine. And that's the significance for our day, for us today, is this. And so if we think about the takeaways, before I go into the narrative part of it, I would say the main takeaways are this, is that he presided over not only the reconstitution of a state in 1918, he became head of state, but he then forged a democratic transition and path in the next 2 years, presiding over the creation of a freely elected parliament, which then drafted a constitution that called for an independent judiciary, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. And the powerful theme for him was that every citizen can vote and that every citizen's vote counts equally. And even though that seems like a fairly basic concept of democracy, it was extraordinarily controversial at the time, because on the right wing of the political spectrum, he comes from a left socialist background. His opponents, who we would call right-wing populists, who envisioned Poland as an ethnic state rather than a civic state. Ethnic meaning it would be a country for Polish-speaking Roman Catholics primarily who would have privilege in the society, and at this really at this kind of infant stage of a new state, some people on the political right felt that only ethnic Poles should actually have their vote count, not specifically not Jews and other minorities, but Jews in particular. So about ancestry, we're going to just go to the legacy of history, and that is that this was the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the 18th century that collapsed and was wiped off the map of Europe in 3 stages. It's what we call the 3 partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795. Now, on the eve of the first partition of Poland, within the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, according to Jewish demographers, lived 45% of world Jewry. So, the literature is saying there was about 1.5 million Jews worldwide in 1770. And of those, 750,000 lived within the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's one of these big questions of history, which is, first of all, why Poland? Like, how do we understand that this was the world's Jewish center in the middle of the 18th century? Why did Jews go to Poland? But one of the things we learned from the history of the partitions is that Jews never moved to Russia because there were no Jews in Russia. Russia came to the Jews, meaning, as we'll see, when the country collapsed, this is the Russian zone of the partition of Poland. This is where 60% of Polish territory came under Russian rule from a country that formally forbade the travel of Jews to their country before the partitions, or Jews. Now, they did have a small Jewish community around Kiev because in the 17th century, and this is much more known among my Jewish students, there was a Cossack Ukrainian uprising in Poland that resulted in the ceding by Poland of this land to Russia. So Kiev came under that, and there were some Jews there. But again, Jews never moved to Russia. Russia moved to the Jews. So we have this legacy of the partitions, and then what the Russians did is they drew a boundary around the territory of Poland that they annexed, and then called it the legal zone of Jewish residence, or the Pale of Jewish settlement, and said Jews are not allowed to travel or to live beyond that territory, the Pale of settlement. Beyond that territory was what? St. Petersburg, Moscow. So the main places, the 2 top industrial centers and cultural centers would be off limits. Now, so where do we understand the subject of our of today's talk, and that is Pisuldzki, and that is that within the course of the 19th century, even though the state of Poland was lost, the Polish people still strove for the reconstitution of a state. And for this reason, there were 2 national armed uprisings. One was in 1830, which failed, but the biggest one was in 1863. And that is when the Poles in this area declared an act of secession, hoping that France and Great Britain would come to their aid. It didn't really happen. But the long and short of it is that Pisuldzki's family was from just north of Vilna in a manor. They lived in a manor house. They were part of an aristocratic landowning family called Zułów here. And when the act of secession took place, something like 30,000 Polish insurgents rose up, and the Russians dispatched from the interior about 120,000 troops to put down the rising for independence. The connection to our subject is that Pisuldzki's father and much of his family were part of the insurrections. Now Pisuldzki was born 4 years after the uprising, but his father during the uprising was named governor of an independent Polish region, and he fully backed the rising. And what followed the uprising is that it was crushed we believe that 26,000 ethnic Poles, but not, or inhabitants of the region that rose up, 26,000 were sent in chains to Siberian exile, among them some Jews, and about 15,000 people went into emigration, mostly in France. The Russians seized land and then executed, we believe, about 700 leaders of the uprising, and then basically declared that Poland is just a concept; it's no longer a reality, and the borders here are permanent and fixed, and there never will be a Poland. Now, 4 years later, Pisuldzki is born. He's the fourth child and second son of this family, where his father was being pursued by the Russians, but they were able to evade arrest. But he grows up in this household in which we can say Polish patriotism is instilled in the children through the reading of forbidden books and forbidden verse. And this is described in the childhood from ages 5 to 10 or 11, where the Russians banned Polish patriotic literature. Mostly they were a group of 3 poets who had went into exile after the uprisings and wrote about the dream of reconstituting Poland. And so he and his older brother discuss how they grew up, in which there was this conspiratorial household where the shades were closed, voices were hushed, and his mother would take out from a secret chamber forbidden books and read them out loud, and then make them remember by heart these verses, patriotic verses of the nation. So he is instilled from a young age with the idea of service to the nation, that she hoped his mother, and these are his parents, Maria and Jozef Pisuldski from 1863, and he claimed he got his intellect from his father and his passion for social justice from his mother. This is a saying that he made about his ancestry, and so his mother, kept the hope of an independent Poland alive. Now, Pisuldzki's family then moved to the city of Vilna, or Vilnius. I don't want to offend anyone from Lithuania by calling it Vilna, which has already happened on Twitter. Some Lithuanians criticizing my book because it doesn't use the proper spelling of Vilnius today. But that wasn't the way it was spelled in the 19th century. So he ends up going to a Russian state gymnasium. And this is here, the young Pisuldzki at age 16 with his older brother Bronislaw, age 17. They actually sat in the same class. And this was a secret reading group in high school, in which they read poetry, histories of the uprisings, and then works on social democracy around the world. Things like basic kind of training them. What is a democratic state? What is a constitution? Because remember, in Russia, that it was just an absolutist monarchy. And then the young Pisuldzki then graduates high school, calling himself by that time a socialist or social democrat, and he attends 1 year at the University of Kharkiv. But it turns out that when he returned for the summer, he got embroiled by just engaging or interacting with a Russian student who was actually a member of a terrorist cell of something called the People's Will, in which they were actually plotting to assassinate the Tsar, which is true, but Pisuldzki and his brother were unaware of that. But because they actually met these people, once the plot was uncovered, both Joseph and his brother Bronislaw were arrested and sent into Siberian exile. So I want to just say something about that in terms of the formation of a character. So Pisuldzki's finished 1 year of college, and I was thinking about my students here. He's 19, and now he's sent off to Siberian exile for 5 years for a crime he didn't commit. It's a crime of association. They actually admitted in the court that he had no direct knowledge of it, but the mere fact that he was interacting with one of the persons of the terrorist cell said that he was kind of a threat to Russia. So they sent him between the ages of 19 and 24, 4,100 miles deep into Siberia, into this small town in which he's in exile, not penal servitude, but just exile. And there between 19 and 24, he's there without any obligations and just and so who does he meet there? There's almost like an underground or makeshift university classroom that happens. Why? Because he then takes up, he finds mentors. And I found this interesting that, and his brother, by the way, older brother was given 15 years penal servitude. This was in a Japanese island that was controlled by the Russians called the Sakhalin Islands, 15 years. And so one of the kind of sad things when you're looking at the correspondence of the young Pisuldzki in Siberian exile is on 3 occasions, he makes an official appeal to be relocated so he can spend exile with his older brother, and it's denied. So they're separated for another 15 years. But going about the mentors, and this really gets into the Jewish aspect of the story. One of the mentors, meaning one of the persons he met, was a man about 38 years old named Stanislav Lande. Who was Stanislav Lande? He happened to be a Pole of Jewish background who in 1878 had been one of the founders of the first Polish Socialist Party in Warsaw. Now, the cell was discovered through a network of secret police, and they were arrested, and he was sent into Siberian exile. 12 years later, Pisuldzki meets one of the founders of the first Polish Socialist Party. Now, why is it significant that he's of a Jewish background? Because it turns out that his uncle, whose name was Michael Lande, was part of a demonstration at Warsaw University in 1861, in which 5 students were shot and killed by Russian gendarmes, and one of them was his uncle, this student, who was actually a Polish Jew who was demonstrating as a Pole, like as someone who wanted a free and democratic state, and he was killed for it. And so why did this become profoundly symbolic and famous? Because then a painter did a rendition of the funeral. It's called The Funeral of the 5 Victims of the Demonstration. And at the funeral is the chief rabbi of Warsaw, the archbishop of the region, another priest, and there's 5 coffins, 4 young Catholic Poles and a Polish Jew. And it is said that when the shooting started, Michael Lande, his uncle, was at the head of a demonstration of some 2,500 students demonstrating, but he had somehow taken up the lead of that demonstration, maybe perhaps the most enthusiastic. And so what Pisuldzki learned here through this, and we know this because letters were preserved that he wrote to someone that he met there. It was actually his kind of his first love, who left 9 months after Pisuldzki arrived, but he wrote maybe about 150 letters to her, and all of them were preserved. So part of this comes from these letters he wrote, is that Lande and his wife would host Pisuldzki on a daily basis, and he was able to actually have books, so he could show, Stanislav Lande discuss what happened to his uncle, so Pisuldzki came up with the idea that there are Jews in Poland who are actually Polish patriots, who actually are one who gave his life for Poland, and one who's now given up his freedom for the last 12 years for Poland. And so I think this is the beginnings of his concept of a state in which ethnic non-Poles who are minorities could be a vital supporters of the Polish patriotic idea, if it is an inclusive idea, right, which is calling for a single set of laws that protects one set of rights for all citizens without regard to religion. So we get that, and then the other aspect of the character, let's say, of Pisuldzki is that he's known to have said that he always said, from as long as I can remember, 6'5", he always abhorred stereotypes. So whenever there were stereotypes around him, someone makes a comment on the Jews, he always knew that they were false. And so he said this is the comment he made at the end of his life. He was always different. He felt different from everyone around him because he just was suspicious of any kind of type of stereotype. Now, the other mentor he had, this was his girlfriend, but is Bronisław Schwarze, who we're not sure if he was of Jewish background. He could have been, but he was a 54-year-old mentor who would lecture the 20-year-old Pisuldzki about history. And he was a hero of the nation because he had actually been in the provisional government that declared secession in 1862 to 1863, and he had been given a sentence, captured, and he was now serving. He was in the 27th year of serving a 30-year sentence of exile. But because of the way that they had this exile, they were free to roam around in these small areas in Siberia. And so Pisuldzki actually, like a student, he sat with pen and paper, and he asked him to recount what happened with this uprising and why it failed. And why do we know he took notes? Because 20 years later, he would give a series of lectures, Pisuldzki, on this uprising, and he quoted verbatim this mentor who had since passed away. So he was like the student in exile, trying to seek some kind of university setting. So I thought that was kind of interesting and important. Now, he does return at the age of 24, but the Russians slap on a very cruel regulation, which we say as part of your release from exile, you have to sign an agreement, and it says that for the next 5 years, you're not allowed to attend university. So now you've not only barred a 19-year-old from continuing his studies, you send him into 4,000 miles away until the age of 24, but now you're saying until you're 29, you can't. So in other words, his future in Russia, he has no future in Russia. So it was actually a very unwise thing for the Russians to do, because what does he do? He goes underground and becomes the leader of a party and a movement that will then literally take Russia down after World War I. And that is that he goes illegal. He goes underground, and that's his time as leader of the Polish Socialist Party that is founded actually abroad, and then it's with Pisuldzki's help, it's established in Imperial Russia. Now, this also has a Jewish connection to it, and that is that the founders of this party, some of them were Polish Jews. And so I'm going to give you this example. So the party itself was founded before Pisuldzki was released from exile. It was in early 1892 in Paris. There were 18 Polish liberals, socialists who drafted a party program. 2 of them were Jewish. It so happens that they were the ones who penned the party program. And if you look at their names, they don't seem that Polish, right? Stan Mendelsohn and Felix Perl. You know, it's not like Piotr Kowalski or some kind of very Polish name. Well, they defined themselves like an American Jew would say, I'm American. They're Poles of Jewish background, right? Their religion is Judaism, but nationally they're Poles. And so they drafted this program, which said, we want a social democracy in an independent Poland. But their first demand was that independence. But they introduced that to Pisuldzki, who takes that up as his mantra, because what he wants is a free, independent Poland, but one that is democratic. So it's 2 aspects. They both become quite close friends, and to give you a sense of how close he was to these two comrades who would then help him lead this party in underground Russia, is that if we turn the clock later in 1908, Pisuldzki leads what we call an expropriation attack on a Russian postal train in which they're trying to seize funds of taxpayer dollars going from the Polish region to St. Petersburg. And they try they're basically like bandits, right? Who stop a train, and they're able to expropriate this cash that's coming. And he thought he may not survive this one because it was going to be the biggest expropriation action with 19 people, firearms. There were Russian police. He knew there would be exchange, and so he drafted his own his own statement of how he wants to be remembered. And he sent this eulogy that he wrote to Felix Pearl. And he said, my good friend, I don't know if I'll survive this, but if I don't, I would like you to give my eulogy. He goes, but if this happens, can you please emphasize these points? But it tells you something about the closeness of the friendship, that that's the person he wrote that eulogy to, his own eulogy to. And we have that full eulogy in Pisuldzki's collective writing. So I go back to the 1987 book by Neil Asherson, in which he said Pisuldzki didn't take much note of who was Jewish, who wasn't in his party, and this is kind of good kind of proof or evidence of that. So the other thing is that Pisuldzki knew that Jews were such an important demographic element, because remember, in Imperial Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, which is where he is from, Jews make up between a third and half of the urban element, especially in Lithuania. So for example, Vilna, where he grew up, because from 7 to 17, he lived in Vilna, it was a town where no single group formed a compact majority, but the single largest group were the Jews, who made up 40% of Vilna. Poles made up 30%, and then you go down Russians, Lithuanians, and so forth. So Pisuldzki grew up as an adolescent, a child and adolescent in a town that was very natural to be walking through a city with many languages, many cultures. I traced the path from where he lived to the Russian State Gymnasium, and I found that he had to go right through the Jewish quarter of Vilna every day. He had Jewish friends in his school, and so this made sense. And so as the leader of this party, which called for an independent Poland, he knew he had to have the support of the Jews. So he decided to gather Jews who were members of his party. These would be like generally Polish-speaking Jews who were followers of this liberal tradition, and he asked them to form a Jewish organization of the party, a kind of Jewish section. So these are some examples of, for example, Max Halperin was the first founder of a circle of Jews who were members of the party, and then Max Horowitz was asked to edit the first Yiddish organ of the party. It was called Der Arbiter. And this is an example of that Yiddish organ. And Max Horowitz was very close to Pisuldzki. The other image here were two other important Jewish figures. So that's basically the 1890s, in which he forms close ties with Jews. He forms a Jewish organization. And for him, it was very important to have a Yiddish paper that would communicate the ideal. So I went into that Yiddish paper very closely, because I want to know what are they actually communicating there? And it's reaching out to the Jews. And the main message is, if you want freedom of religion, basic democratic institutions in which you have internal religious autonomy, but as individuals you have a constitutional framework for freedom. He goes, the only way that's going to come about is not through the reconstitution of like a democratic Russia, because he believed Russia wouldn't become, but through a Poland, right? So this is what they were trying to do, is reach out to the Jewish community in that way. Now, I wanted to give an example of Pisuldzki's writings during the time, just so you can kind of get a sense, and that is that he was, and I thought I put this, okay, so he was editor and founder of the party's newspaper. It was called Robotnik, which in Polish means the worker, and in which he was able to get a printing press smuggled in from Germany, and in some secret location, they would churn out monthly issues of a newspaper, the possession of which was punishable by Siberian exile. He was on the most wanted list of the Russian state. And this journal was hammering away at autocratic Russia, that the only way to have a free and democratic land is to separate from like the Russian stranglehold. But one of the aspects of this was his writings about the Jews. So I give this example where in 1898, he writes a specific editorial. It's on the right-hand side. You see it says, oh, you can't see it, but it says on the Jewish question. So I want to just read to you what is the main argument in his article on the Jewish question. And this is his statement to the Polish people, quote, "Any trace of anti-Semitism among our comrades will be persistently fought against, and under no circumstance will we allow its manifestation in the life of our movement," unquote. So that's the editorial he wrote. And why? Because among Polish socialists, anti-Semitism was coming to the surface in certain circles of socialists. And then because anti-Semitism was a problem, he decided he had to write on the subject more frequently. So his next editorial what stated the following, is also in Robotnik, and I just wanted to quote. This is his words: "With all its energy, our Socialist Party will fight against anti-Semitism as an injurious and backward current. Russian policies limiting the rights of any group, including Jews, is repugnant to us and our party." So he's speaking about the fact that in Tsarist Russia, there were about 100 anti-Jewish laws in the legal codes limiting the rights of Jews. And that was what we call institutionalized anti-Semitism. So he was kind of railing against that. In a free society, you can't really have that. Do I have about 10 more minutes or 10 more? Okay. So he was a foe of anti-Semitism for sure, but what comes out in his writings is that he's more an anti-Semite in the sense that he will start making this argument that anti-Semitism is a threat to the democratic ideal. So you can't have a democratic, free society that allows in any way the limitation of rights on any group, especially the Jews. So this will be his main argument. So when he defends the Jews, or he comes out to condemn anti-Semitism, when he's speaking to kind of his own people, he's saying that if you want a democratic future, then you must oppose anti-Semitism. So that was his main, let's say, main statement or main position on the Jews. Now, in 1900, finally, after 6 years, the Russian police actually capture him. He's with, at that time, his wife. I'll just show you, he's at that time with his wife, Maria Pisuldzki, and his stepdaughter, Wanda, who's at this time 12 years old. And he is sent to a high security prison in Warsaw. And the party helps him with a scheme. It's really kind of a kind of a Hollywood movie type of scheme, which is, they say, okay, in this high security prison in Warsaw, there's really no way to escape. So our prescription, or what we recommend, is that you fake insanity in order to get transferred to a mental hospital in St. Petersburg. And it's there that security is lax and you could probably escape. So he's given actually instructions from a psychiatrist on the symptoms of mental disorder. Say, if you want to be diagnosed as having mental, you have to exhibit these. So he's able to do this, and they actually transfer him, as this map shows, all the way to St. Petersburg. And 1 year later, he is able to concoct a scheme in which a Polish university student gets a degree in psychiatry and is a sympathizer of the party. He gets a job at the hospital, and he carries out this escape route. So they do escape, and he and his wife get all the way to Austria. If you'll see down here, they're able to escape through Estonia, through Kyiv, and finally they get into Austrian Galicia. Now, what's the significance of this? Which is that Austrian Galicia is part of Austria-Hungary, which is a constitutional state with a lot more freedoms. So that's where he spends between 1901 until World War I. And there he takes up the idea of the military solution to the problem. So one of the things about this particular figure, it's known that he had an extraordinary analytical ability with a high native intellect. And one of one of the ways he applied that was to study military history. And he was an absolute admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte, because Napoleon Bonaparte not only liberated areas of Europe, captive peoples of Europe, but he extended to them democratic freedoms. But he was also fascinated with how Napoleon could defeat so many powerful armies, one after another. So he got into this, he was a voracious reader of military history, and he decided, after a visit to Japan, in which he met Japanese officials during the Russo-Japanese War, that a Polish popular rising is never going to expel the Russian armed forces. It's only going to bring catastrophe on the population of that region. But what could possibly achieve the independence of Poland would be a Polish armed force under command of one of the great powers against Russia. So that would be either Austria-Hungary or Germany. And so that's what he was kind of banking on. And this is a photograph from 1913, which is that he then gets permission from the Austrian government to form a Polish paramilitary organization called the Riflemen. He starts training officers, and on the eve of World War I, there's about 7,800 troops, Polish troops under his command. And then, in a way, he's now trying to look at the map of Europe and figure out how is it possible in the most tricky, most complicated diplomacy possible to play the great powers against one another, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, to help bring about an independent Polish state. And what he realized is the only way is if Austria, Hungary, and Germany go to war with Russia and expel Russians from Polish lands. That's the only way you're gonna expel the Russian troops. But then you have the problem is, what do you do with Austria, Hungary, and Germany, because they're now on Polish lands? Well, he ended up forming something called the Polish Legions, and this is him in December 1914 in Krakow. Remember, World War I starts in August 1914, and one of the things about those legions is that it attracts an inordinate amount of Jews to this military formation. So this is an example of just the veneration for Pisuldzki, who has no military training, but he's now anointed as kind of head of a nucleus of a Polish army before there is a Poland. So it's kind of fascinating. This is an example of how he's regarded. But what's interesting is that in the study of the legions, what I came across are materials where you could make this conclusion based on the evidence that about 1 in every 10 soldiers of the Polish legions happen to be Jews. So if anyone here is familiar with this extraordinary photo album from 1981 called Image Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Polish Jews, there's a lot of photographs of these Jewish soldiers of the Polish army. So I want to give this example of one Jewish soldier of Pisuldzki's legions. He was an officer who perished on the battlefield fighting the Russians in 1915. He became a symbol of Polish-Jewish collective memory, at least one aspect of it, because he was a Jew who gave his life for what did he give his life for? Well, for the cause of Poland. And what did that mean? That was Pisuldzki's Poland, a tolerant, open, pluralistic Poland in which laws would protect the rights of minorities, in which Jews could flourish, in which every vote counted without regard to sex, race, religion, right? And so they were drawn to him. So he's an example. And then I wanted to give you this very fascinating story about a Polish Jewish artist. His name was Arthur Szyk, S-Z-Y-K, and he became a leading artist in Poland. And in 1928, he exhibited in Paris a series of 46 paintings on the history of Jews in Poland. And it today is actually a very coveted book. Strange little anecdote. So I went on my favorite used book search site. It's called abebooks.com. And I was curious, is this even available? Because it came out in 1928 in French. And I found out there was one copy in the available, but it was priced at $35,000. So that's, and for like a 50-page book, $35,000 is the only copy available that out there, the used book, in used bookstores. And so why is this so important? First of all, he became a venerated artist who emigrates before World War II, and during World War II, he moved to New York and he became a propaganda cartoonist and artist for the United States military during World War II, and he lives out the rest of his life in New York. But I wanted to give you this example. So one of his figures is figure number 11, and it's called The Death of Bronislaw Monsborough. So you see, it's very elaborate, of showing this battle in which a Jewish soldier of the Polish legions is leading an armed force against Russia, and he perishes for Poland. The other is one called, which is so interesting, it's figure number 42, in which it kind of marks a moment where Poles and Jews rose up in a labor strike in a Polish town in 1905, in a town in Lodz in 1905. And when you look in that, I wanted to show you, you'll notice it says PPS, which is the Polish acronym for Polish Socialist Party. But when you look closer, and I did a close-up here, you'll notice that it says PPS, but then in Yiddish, it says PPS Jiddische Frakcja, meaning Jewish section of the Polish Socialist Party. And so who actually organized that? That was Pisuldzki, and he was the one who drew in the Jews. So it was this sense that that he had led a movement that envisioned a tolerant state. Then it turned out that the dedication page of the artwork was dedicated to Jozef Pisuldski. And you can see that there's a kind of intricate works here celebrating. But again, it tells you something about that this artist dedicated the volume to Pisuldzki. So, and this is General Pisuldzki in World War I on the eve of his arrest. And that is that in July 1917, the Germans arrested him. Why? Because they demanded that he swear publicly an oath of loyalty to the Kaiser of Germany. And he said he can only swear an oath of loyalty to his own country. So he won't, and they arrested him. So for the next 16 months, he's what we call a prisoner of conscience. He languishes in this German military prison, and he now becomes literally the hero of Poland. And so what I found is that the first appearance of his name in the Times of London and the New York Times and a French newspaper was 3 days after he was arrested, and in which suddenly they're encountering this figure who's now been arrested, and there's protests in Warsaw, and then he's now reported on Milan as kind of the acknowledged leader of the nation. So I'm just gonna zoom out for a moment, if you can, about the history of World War I, which is that, remember that Poland doesn't exist, but the first champion of Poland is the United States. And that is that in January 1917, and remember this is before the United States enters the war. So they're a neutral party at this point. They're neutral. They haven't entered. They don't side with either. Woodrow Wilson gives a famous speech, which he calls Peace Without Victory. So he's calling on the Europeans to stop the slaughter, this senseless war, where it's not even clear what people are fighting for at this point. But in that speech, he says one of the outcomes of this war must be an independent, autonomous Poland. So just that statement was very important, that the United States president championed the freedom of the Polish people. And it's clear that he did that for ideological reasons. He said, you just can't have a world anymore where whole peoples are subjugated by large empires just by use of force. So it's what he called the right of peoples to self-determination. And he applied that particularly to the Poles. So this was an important moment. And then finally, on November 11th at 5 p.m., the guns of Europe fall silent after 5 years of unprecedented carnage and destruction. But on that day, or the day before, Pisuldzki is released from the German prison, and he arrives in Warsaw with crowds of people because he's hailed as likely the leader of Poland. And it's an extraordinary moment. I wanted to go back to this picture of him. It's an extraordinary moment because he was 50 years old on that day. And while he was in prison, his wife gave birth to their first child. Actually, I'm sorry, this is confusing. He actually was in a second marriage, and he had not had children yet, but it was his dream. And so she had a child while he was in prison. He knew that his daughter was 8 months old. He'd never held, never seen. He arrives where there's throngs of people hailing him as the leader of the country. He has high-level meetings with authorities. He's bestowed upon him as the title of commander-in-chief, head of state. They direct him to his residence, and he's trying to find a way to get to his wife and an 8-month-old daughter. He finally, at the end of the day, is able to avert crowds and get to this home and meet his daughters. It's a very incredible moment where he sets foot on free Polish soil for the first time in his life at age 50 and meets his daughter for the first time. But he is hailed as head of state. Now, these are just some images, which is that he forms the first government within 8 days of the end of World War I. So the day that 8 days after Poland is declared a state. And then we look at just about politics, which is that during World War I in France, Polish populists, I'm going to use the word populist, so it's what we may call nationalists. They were, not all of them, but the leader, whose name was Roman Dmowski, was known for his anti-Semitism, open and public. He didn't hide it. They were right-wing populists, nationalists. And in fact, they totally opposed Piłsudski's rule. And the Allies recognized this body in Paris as the actual legitimate government in Poland. It took about 3 months for them to work this out, but eventually they combined forces and form a coalition government under someone named Ignacy Paderewski. Some of you music lovers may know him, international renowned pianist. And so what he does, and this is a main takeaway, is how are democracies formed in the course of a brand new state being created? Because remember, and I want to just go to a map so you can see this, that it's carved out of 3 fallen empires. So the Russian Empire collapses, the German and the Austrian. So Poland's carved out of 3 territories, and it's a very large population, and Piłsudski wants a democratic Poland. So he forms a government, then he calls for elections to a parliament. That parliament then meets on February 20th or 10, 1919. And this is a picture of him and his prime minister on their way to address the reborn Poland's first freely elected parliament. And what he does on that day I think is extraordinary, because remember, he was named head of state. He wasn't elected that. And so what he did is he opened the assembly, and then he formally resigned as head of state. He said he's not a legitimate head of state unless he's elected. And in this parliamentary system, the parliament has to take a vote. So they actually unanimously restated him as head of state. So now he felt that he was legitimate. These are just some photos of soldiers who I thought was interesting, with a photograph of Piłsudski and then someone named Thaddeus Kosciuszko, an American military general who fought for the restoration of Poland in the 18th century. But we'll go to some other things. So what about going back to Jewish themes? So we should remember that when Poland becomes a state, it administers an area much smaller than Poland would become. And Piłsudski wanted to expel Russians eastward as far back as possible, so as to make space for independent-minded peoples like the Ukrainians. So he was the first champion of Ukrainian independence in this sense, that in 1920, he actually made an agreement with a Ukrainian general they signed a pact. And in April, May, the two forces literally wrested Kyiv from Russian control, and they declared an independent, democratic, free Ukraine. Now, that lasted for a total of 45 days. Then the Russian army counterattacked and were very successful. And so the Ukrainian armed force kind of dissolved, and the Poles kept retreating about 5 miles from the capital. And so in August 1920, there was a moment in Europe where it was believed that if Warsaw falls, because it was very likely it would fall at this point, the army had retreated all the way back to the capital. Russian troops were approaching actually the east bank of Warsaw, and the capitals of Europe were in a chaotic feeling that if Poland falls, the Red Army is just going to keep advancing, because remember, Germany was demilitarized, and a cable got detected and published in the London Times between Vladimir Lenin in Leningrad and his top general on the ground near Warsaw, in which the top general was instructed that if Warsaw falls, then on to Berlin, Paris, and London for the creation of a European Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, when this got out in the London Times, it became much more clear that the defense of Poland is not just about Poland, it's about the freedom of Europe. And so one of the connections I make here is that Pisuldzki starts making speeches that sound almost word for word the same as President Zelensky of Ukraine today, because he's saying this is about the preservation of the West, of Western values, of democratic ideals. And so support for Poland is not just about Poland. So he's making these statements. There's a time, and so at this point, Pisuldzki, as commander-in-chief, devises a battle plan for a counteroffensive. While the Russians are 6 miles from Warsaw, and it takes place on August 16th, 1920. It's wildly successful. He's able, as a military, some call him a military genius, to find out where the weak links were, and the counteroffensive forced the Russians to retreat. But one of the towns that they liberated was this town. It was called Dęblin, and when the Polish army arrived, because Pisuldzki was leading the forces, became the iconic image of Pisuldzki and the Jews, and that is that the heads of the Jewish community greeted the commander of the Polish armed forces with presenting him salt and bread, and Pisuldzki greeted them and said, welcome, and he told them the Polish army is friendly and will protect them. And you'll notice here he signed this, and then these were distributed. This is his signature to show kind of his intentions towards the Jews. What I found interesting is that as more and more books come out about Polish Jews, I haven't found one of them that does not include this photo. So what is this photo from? It's from the memorial book of the Jewish community of this town that then, suffered during the Shoah and Holocaust, but after got mementos and photographs to try to reconstruct a story of the history of that town. And this was one of the images in that Sefer Yizkor memorial book. But it becomes this kind of iconic idea or image. Now, the last part of my discussion about Pisuldzki will be about what happens in the first year and a half of Polish statehood, and that is that it goes to war with 5 neighbors. It has a war with Ukrainians, with Russians, with Lithuanians, with Czechs and Germans. And in those battles, pogroms broke out on both sides. There's an incredibly delicate and controversial issue, the outbreak of pogroms. But we know that between 1918 and 1920, the vast majority of pogroms took place in the midst of the Russian Civil War between the Red Army and the White Army in what's today Ukraine. But also when Poland was fighting the Russians, usually in the immediate aftermath of the capture of towns, there'd be outbreak of violence. And so because of this, Pisuldzki received on 2 occasions in the end of November 1918, delegations of Polish Jews. They were heads of the Zionist Party and Agudat Yisrael. And he sat with them and they presented reports. This is what we know is going on. And they said, Commandant Pisuldzki, please make a speech condemning the pogroms and calling on them to stop. And so this is one of the conundrums or one of the ruminations I have in the book, which is his response is very surprising and disappointing and shocking, which he says he won't make that announcement. He says that he's sent orders to every commander of every unit that this is illegal, that any attack on Jews is criminal and will be prosecuted. So he's saying that's what he's doing now, and right now there's complete chaos on the border because there's no actual real border, but he won't make the announcement. And so in this transcript that I quote, he's asked, why won't you make the announcement? And he says, I'm not authorized to do so because I wasn't elected head of state. This is in 1918 still. This is when he was just named head of state right on the day World War I ended. So he says, only when a parliament is formed and they choose a head of state, a freely elected parliament, head of state, he and only that he can and only then speak in the name of the nation. And so the Jews felt abandoned and felt like this was a betrayal. It's kind of like a betrayal. And so it's still to this day discussed what's the logic there? I'm not authorized to condemn the pogroms. It's still discussed in Polish-Jewish relations, histories of Polish Jewry, and trying to reconstruct what happened and actually what were his views. Because it turns out that during the 1920 war that I mentioned to you, where he mounted a counteroffensive against the Russians in August 1920. So one of the black spots in Polish-Jewish relations is this fact, which is on the day the counteroffensive started, Pisuldzki's Minister of War ordered a group of Jewish soldiers of the Polish army to be removed from the ranks and put in an internment camp, I guess you could say, out of suspicion or allegations that they were pro-Bolshevik or pro-communist. So you literally had Jewish soldiers of the Polish army, patriots, who just because they were Jews were pulled out of the armed forces for alleged pro-Bolshevik or pro. And 28 days later, they were let out of this internment camp. And we have some testimonies from what happened. Nobody was harmed in that. And it was 28 days. But after the Russians were defeated, then they dissolved this camp. The question was, did he know about that? Did he give that order? What was his opinion? And so what I can say in the book is that in the course of those 28 days, he's interviewed, and I cite his interview, and they're asking about it. It wasn't particularly known at the time. And he's asked about this case of Jews, or there's these rumors that Jews have been mistreated. And then he basically says, most Jewish soldiers have behaved patriotically and bravely. And he talked about cases where Jewish soldiers were injured on the front lines or perished. But then he said but there are 3 cases in which there were Jewish soldiers who laid down their arms and joined the Red Army. So it's clear that he had he had mixed feelings about it. So despite his kind of ideology against anti-Semitism, here he seems to have bought some of those conclusions. So I only end by saying that upon his death in 1935, there was mourning across the country, but in particular, there was mourning of the Jews. And I cite a lot of these, but they're very moving. They're moving statements by Polish Jews. I just wanted to give one, and I'll only say it because it's the one that I first heard that really made me think that I should research more about this figure, and that is that the late Dina Abramovich was head librarian of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. She passed away in 2001, but she was a Polish Jew who was born and raised in Vilna, and she was 16 when Pisuldzki died. And in a documentary, she made this statement, and that is the following, and I'm quoting her. this is the day that Pisuldzki died, and she remembered. She goes, quote, "We felt like a dark cloud was hovering over the Jews of Poland, that difficult times were ahead," unquote. So that was her sense or feeling. And then other Polish Jews talk about that there was this sense of a huge divide between their country when he was head of the country and living, and then after he died, because there was a swing towards a right-wing and anti-Semitic government between the death of Pisuldzki and the end of the Second Polish Republic when World War II started. And one of the things I cite is that 10 days after Pisuldzki died, there was an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence in a town called Grodno. And I came across a testimony of someone who was 18 at the time, and he wrote many years after the war. He said that the Polish hoodlums or thugs, when they approached him, they said, "Now that Pisuldzki's gone, there's no one to protect you." And then they started attacking him. But that tells you something about the mentality, that there was a sense that while he was living, the country wouldn't allow anti-Jewish excesses. But after he died, there was a sense that there was no limitation. So I'll end right there and see if there's any questions.
Okay, thank you. Let's start in the room. Are there any questions in the room? I've got a couple here on the chat. But are there any questions from our live audience?
So maybe we'll go, should we go
Okay,
to
so
the chat?
let me go to the chat. There was a couple of questions here.
Okay.
One from Avi Pisuldzki, who asks, did Pisuldzki want to include former Polish areas like parts of Belarus in his democratic Poland? Did he want to restore Poland's original bounds?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. An excellent question. And so he wanted to restore the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that collapsed in 1795. So his goal was to push Russia back to the boundaries before the first partition of Poland and to restore that heritage. What's unclear is what he wanted to do with that, but he's on record in 1920 saying we want to push Russia all the way back to the borders of 1772 in order to allow for a free and independent Ukraine. So Ukraine, Belarus, he believed, were countries that had a different heritage than Russia, and that Russia had no claims other than annexationist claims.
Okay, that answers your question, Avi. And a couple from Noah Bursky who asks, and this actually, I suppose, is between periods you discussed, how did he justify the 1926 coup?
Okay.
And then he asked also, why did the government of the colonels not continue his opposition to anti-Semitism? Okay,
so these are great questions. Let me just go back. So in 1926, Pisuldzki had resigned from politics out of disgust for what was going on in Poland at the time, and that is that I'm going to go back for a moment to this, which is what are these photographs of? So is that in 1923 he changed residence to a kind of manor house that was in the country about 25 miles outside of Warsaw, and he resigned from public life where he lived with his family because in 1922 the first presidential elections took place. They were free and fair elections. There were actually monitors there who verified this. And the candidate who won was Pisuldzki's choice. He was on the left, a liberal, a leftist. His name was Gabriel Narutowicz. But because minorities made up 30% of the vote, the right started claiming that this was fraudulent and an illegitimate election, because if only ethnic Poles were able to vote, then their guy would have won. And they launched a vicious press campaign calling Narutowicz an illegitimate president. And people started marching on the Capitol demanding that their guy be an and 5 days later, he was assassinated, Gabriel Narutowicz. So if you think about the tragedy here, the restoration of Poland after 123 years of independence. And then 5 days after the first presidential election, the candidate who wins that is assassinated by a right-wing fanatic who claims he did it for Poland. It was a right-wing fanatic who was openly anti-Semitic and claimed that Narutowicz and Pisuldzki were trying to create a, quote, Judeo-Poland, and that the reason he had to kill and assassinate the president is to show that this is unacceptable to the Polish people, and that he did this for his country. Now, 1 month after this act, he was tried, found guilty, and he was actually executed. But what really disgusted, so first of all, Pisuldzki said, this is not the Poland I spent my whole life fighting for. Remember, his whole adult life, he was in prisons, in exile, and fighting for the state. And at 50, it comes about. And he's saying, this is not the state I fought for, which is a political act of violence and a people who don't seem to be ready for a democratic society in which the outcome of elections are expected, and there's a peaceful transition of power. But what really got to him was that it was reported after the execution at the beginning of 1923 that there were some Poles who were putting images of the assassin in their window and with the words "martyr of the nation," that they were actually praising the assassin. And he decided that he was too disgusted to have any part in this government anymore. So he spends 3 years with his family, in the country. So why the coup? The coup is that in May 1926, after a succession of short-lived governments in which the Polish currency started collapsing, it went from something like 6 in 1926. It went from 6 to the dollar to 17 Polish zloty to the dollar. So people's savings were being destroyed. There were protests, there were strikes, and the president of Poland dissolved the government and named a new cabinet. And it was for the first time, they were all right-wing members of political parties. And they were the very parties that had actually played a role in the vicious press campaign to try to delegitimize the president, the first elected president. So he actually literally, with about 2,600 loyal soldiers, he came from his country home. He led these soldiers through the East Bank of Warsaw. He crossed the bridge on the Vistula. On the other side was the president of Poland. And he said, I demand that you dissolve this government. And the president, who was an old socialist comrade of him, says, no, this is illegal. And it's true, it was a legally, constitutionally appointed government. But he says, this is not the Poland that I fought for. I will not allow this. You must. And so the president said no. So troops loyal to the president started fighting troops loyal to Pisuldzki. And after 3 days, it was literally civil war. We know that 200 troops lay dead and 1,000 civilians were injured. Pisuldzki was successful. The government resigned, and then now he now heads a new government. But it was a tragedy. Now, why do we know that he had every expectation that this would be a peaceful transition of power, in the sense that the president would concede to him? Is because the memoirs of his wife shows that when he left at 7 in the morning, he talked about what he wanted for lunch. They actually set. He was actually he was excited to talk about what he'll have at 2 o'clock. So he really obviously thought. So the coup is really about his belief that this new right-wing government was going to undermine democratic rule. It was going to persecute minorities, and that it was spiraling the country into chaos. And so he wanted to restore order. So in his view, he was saving democracy. Now, I want to emphasize that at that point, when he succeeded, he had absolute power. He could have become a dictator. And in 1926, we already had Mussolini in Italy, who'd become a one-party dictator in Italy, where the fascist party was the sole legal party. So he had a model out there, but he allowed he preserved the Constitution. He allowed opposition parties in the parliament. He allowed opposition presses to function and open criticism of him, but he became now the strong man. He wanted to have his hand on the law of the land, on the Constitution, and to make sure there weren't egregious violations. What's interesting about this is there was overwhelming Jewish support for the coup in Poland. And now why was there overwhelming Jewish support? So first of all, I want to show you that Pisuldzki was on the cover of Time magazine in July 1926. And surprisingly, of July 1926, so that's 1 month after the coup, he's actually praised in this article. I cite it, and he's praised in part because at least the magazine is saying that he was saving Poland from going down an anti-Semitic road. Why? Because that new government had some members who had an anti-Semitic past. And so they actually thought this was a good thing, which is unusual for the United States to say it's good that someone just did an extra legal, unconstitutional military takeover of power. But he claims it was a means to a good ends, right? And I want to just show you in that 2 years later, they organized the first post-coup parliamentary elections. And this is a campaign poster I found at the archives of the YIVO Institute. It's a bilingual Hebrew-Polish leaflet urging Jews to vote for Pisuldzki and his bloc. And it's from a small town in eastern Poland called Stanisław. And interestingly, you'll notice that on the bottom, it's signed by a group of 4 rabbis with their imprint down here. So it's kind of a sense of this Jewish support. And then in that same parliamentary election, I reprint this in the book. I found it one of the most astounding images, and that is, this is a cartoonist who supported Pisuldzki, and he produced this in a daily newspaper, and the title of it is "How the Right Sees General Pisuldzki." And so Pisuldzki is portrayed as an Orthodox Jew reading the Yiddish daily paper Heint with a menorah and challah bread, and beside him is Trotsky. So he's rubbing shoulders with communists, and on the bottom is a priest. So they're like squelching Catholicism, and they're promoting communism, right? That was the view of Pisuldzki, that he was actually a Jew. And in fact, there were some bizarre cases in which his opponents tried to make the claim that he was actually of Jewish background, and that's why he's pro-Jewish. What I found interesting is his response to that, which was never to actually ever give credence to these claims. He never actually would. He said he wouldn't lower himself to even reply to things like that. But this image, as you can see, is pretty dramatic, showing him as an Orthodox Jew.
Okay, well, it's almost 9 o'clock.
Okay.
So I think we will draw to a close, but
Okay.
thank you very much first to Zimmerman for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everybody who's come here, whether virtually or in person. And just to mention actually that next week, I think in the very same location, we have another Revel event with Professor Schmar Feiner from Borough University, who will be talking about, I will find the title very quickly, but it's modern Jewish history, kind of 18th century, I believe, 19th century, is the general tenor. And you'll see posters and things all around YU. So please do, if you're interested, join us again next week.
Great. Thank you very much.